Section 9 of Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure by John CLELAND. Letter the Second, Part 9. My gentleman had now put on his clothes and recomposed himself, when giving me a kiss and placing me by him, he sat himself down as gingerly as possible, with one side off the cushion, which was too sore for him to bear resting any part of his weight on. Here he thanked me for the extreme pleasure I had procured him, and seeing, perhaps, some marks in my countenance of terror and apprehension of retaliation on my own skin, for what I had been the instrument of his suffering in his, he assured me that he was ready to give up to me any engagement I might deem myself under to stand him, as he had done me, but if that proceeded in my consent to it, he would consider the difference of my sex, its greater delicacy and incapacity to undergo pain. Reheartened at which, and piqued in honour as I thought, not to flinch so near the trial, especially as I well knew Mrs. Cole was an eye-witness from her stand of espial, to the whole of our transactions, I was now less afraid of my skin than of his not furnishing me with an opportunity of signalizing my resolution. Consonant to this disposition was my answer, but my courage was still more in my head than in my heart, and as cowards rush into the danger they fear, in order to be the sooner rid of the pain of that sensation, I was entirely pleased with his hastening matters into execution. He had then little to do but to unloose the strings of my petticoats, and lift them, together with my shift, navel high, where he just tucked them up, loosely girt, and might be slipped up higher at pleasure. Then viewing me round with great seeming delight, he laid me at length on my face upon the bench, and when I expected he would tie me, as I had done him, and held out my hands, not without fear and a little trembling, he told me he would by no means terrify me unnecessarily with such a confinement, for that though he meant to put my constancy to some trial, the standing it was to be completely voluntary on my side, and therefore I might be at full liberty to get up whenever I found the pain too much for me. You cannot imagine how much I thought myself bound by being thus allowed to remain loose, and how much spirit this confidence in me gave me, so that I was even from my heart careless how much my flesh might suffer in honour of it. All my back parts, naked half-way up, were now fully at his mercy, and first he stood at a convenient distance, delighting himself with a gloating survey of the attitude I lay in, and of all the secret stores I thus exposed to him in fair display. Then, springing eagerly towards me, he covered all those naked parts with a fond profusion of kisses, and now, taking hold of the rod, rather wantoned with me in gentle inflictions on those tender trembling masses of my flesh behind, than in any way hurt them, till by degrees he began to tingle them with smarter lashes, so as to provoke a red colour into them, which I knew as well by the flagrant glow I felt there, as by his telling me they now emulated the native roses of my other cheeks. When he had thus amused himself with admiring and toying with them, he went on to strike harder and more hard, so that I needed all my patience not to cry out, or complain at least. At last he twigged me so smartly as to fetch blood in more than one lash, at sight of which he flung down the rod, flew to me, kissed away the starting drops, and sucking the wounds eased a good deal of my pain, but now raising me on my knees, and making me kneel with them straddling wide, that tender part of me, naturally the province of pleasure not of pain, came in for its share of suffering, for now, eyeing it wistfully, he directed the rod so that the sharp ends of the twigs lighted there so sensibly that I could not help wincing and writhing my limbs with smart, so that my contortions of body must necessarily throw it into infinite variety of postures and points of view fit to feast the luxury of the eye. But still I bore everything without crying out, when presently giving me another pause, he rushed, as it were, on that part whose lips, and round about, had felt this cruelty, and by way of reparation, glues his own to them. Then he opened, shut, squeezed them, plucked softly the overgrowing moss, and all this in a style of wild, passionate rapture and enthusiasm that expressed excess of pleasure, till betaking himself to the rod again, encouraged by my passiveness, and infuriated with this strange taste of delight, he made my poor posteriors pay for the ungovernableness of it. For now, showing them no quarter, the traitor cut me so that I wanted but little of fainting away, when he gave over, and yet I did not utter one groan or angry expostulation, but in heart I resolved nothing so seriously as never to expose myself again to the like severities. You may guess then in what a curious pickle those soft flesh cushions of mine were, all sore, raw, and in fine, terribly clawed off, but so far from feeling any pleasure in it, that the recent smart made me pout a little, and not with the greatest air of satisfaction receive the compliments and after caresses of the author of my pain. As soon as my clothes were huddled on in a little decency, a supper was brought in by the discreet Mrs. Cole herself, which might have piqued the sensuality of a cardinal, accompanied with a choice of the richest wines, all which she set before us, and went out again, without having, by a word or even by a smile, given us the least interruption or confusion, in those moments of secrecy that were not yet ripe to the admission of a third too. I sat down then, still scarce in charity with my butcher, for such I could not help considering him, and was, moreover, not a little piqued at the gay, satisfied air of his countenance, which I thought myself insulted by. But when the now necessary refreshment to me of a glass of wine, a little eating, all the time observing a profound silence, had somewhat cheered and restored me to spirits, and as the smart began to go off, my good humour returned accordingly, which alteration not escaping him, he said and did everything that could confirm me in, and indeed exalt it. But scarce was supper well over before a change so incredible was wrought in me. Such violent yet pleasingly irksome sensations took possession of me that I scarce knew how to contain myself. The smart of the lashes was now converted into such a prickly heat, such fiery tinglings, as made me sigh, squeeze my thighs together, shift and wriggle about my seat, with a furious restlessness, whilst these itching ardours, thus excited in those parts on which the storm of discipline had principally fallen, detached legions of burning, subtle, stimulating spirits, to their opposite spot and centre of assemblage, where their titillation raged so furiously, that I was even stinging mad with them. No wonder then that in such a taking, and devoured by flames that licked up all modesty and reserve, my eyes, now charged brimful of the most intense desire, fired on my companion very intelligible signals of distress. My companion, I say, who grew in them every instant more amiable, and more necessary to my urgent wishes and hopes of immediate ease. Mr. Barville, no stranger by experience to these situations, soon knew the pass I was brought to, soon perceived my extreme disorder, in favour of which, removing the table out of the way, he began a prelude that flattered me with instant relief, to which I was not, however, so near as I imagined, for he was unbuttoned to me, and tried to provoke and rouse to action his unactive, torpid machine. He blushingly owned that no good was to be expected from it, unless I took it in hand to re-excite its languid loitering powers, by just refreshing the smart of the yet recent blood-raw cuts, seeing it could no more than a boy's top keep up without lashing. Sensible then that I should work as much for my own profit as his, I hurried my compliance with his desire, and abridging the ceremonial, whilst he leaned his head against the back of a chair, I had scarce gently made him feel the lash, before I saw the object of my wishes give signs of life, and presently, as it were with a magic touch, it started up into a noble size and distinction indeed. Hastening then to give me the benefit of it, He threw me down on the bench, but such was the refreshed soreness of those parts behind, on my leaning so hard on them, as became me to compass the admission of that stupendous head of his machine, that I could not possibly bear it. I got up then, and tried, by leaning forwards, and turning the crupper on my assailant, to let him at the back avenue, but here it was likewise impossible to stand his bearing so fiercely against me, in his agitations and endeavours to enter that way, whilst his belly battered directly against the recent sore. What should we do now? Both intolerably heated, both in a fury, but pleasure is ever invented for its own ends. He strips me in a trice, stark naked, and placing a broad settee cushion on the carpet before the fire, oversets me gently, topsy-turvy on it, and handling me only at the waist, whilst you may be sure I favoured all my dispositions, brought my legs round his neck, so that my head was kept from the floor only by my hands and the velvet cushion, which was now bespread with my flowing hair. Thus I stood on my head and hands, supported by him in such manner, that whilst my thighs clung round him, so as to expose to his sight all my back figure, including the theatre of his bloody pleasure, the centre of my fore-part fairly bearded the object of its rage, that now stood in fine condition to give me satisfaction for the injuries of its neighbours. But as this posture was certainly not the easiest, and our imaginations, wound up to the height, could suffer no delay, he first, with the utmost eagerness and effort, just lip-lodged that broad acorn-fashioned head of his instrument, and still frenzied by the fury with which he had made that impression, he soon stuffed in the rest, when now, with a pursuit of thrusts, fiercely urged, he absolutely overpowered and absorbed all sense of pain and uneasiness, whether from my wounds behind, my most untoward posture, or the oversize of his stretcher, in an infinitely predominant delight, when now all my whole spirits of life and sensation, rushing impetuously to the cockpit, where the prize of pleasure was hotly in dispute, and clustering to a point there, I soon received the dear relief of nature from these over-violent strains and provocations of it, harmonizing with which, my gallant spouted into me such a potent overflow of the balsamic injection, as softened and unedged all those irritating stings of a new species of titillation, which I had been so intolerably maddened with, and restored the ferment of my senses to some degree of composure. I had now achieved this rare adventure ultimately much more to my satisfaction than I had bespoken the nature of it to turn out, nor was it much lessened, you may think, by my Spark's lavish praises of my constancy and complaisance, which he gave weight to by a present that greatly surpassed my utmost expectation, besides his gratification to Mrs. Cole. I was not, however, at any time re-enticed to renew with him, or resort again to the violent expedient of lashing nature into more haste than good speed, which, by the way, I conceive acts somewhat in the manner of a dose of Spanish flies, with more pain perhaps, but less danger, and might be necessary to him, but was nothing less so than to me, whose appetite wanted the bridle more than the spur. Mrs. Cole, to whom this adventurous exploit had more and more endeared me, looked on me now as a girl after her own heart, afraid of nothing, and on a good account, hardly enough to find all the weapons of pleasure through, attentive then, in consequence of these favourable conceptions, to promote either my profit or pleasure. She had special regard for the first, in a new gallant of a very singular turn, that she procured for and introduced to me. This was a grave, staid, solemn, elderly gentleman, whose peculiar humour was a delight in combing fine tresses of hair, and as I was perfectly headed to his taste, he used to come constantly at my toilette hours, when I let down my hair as loose as nature, and abandoned it to him to do what he pleased with it, and accordingly he would keep me an hour or more in play with it, drawing the comb through it, winding the curls round his fingers, even kissing it as he smoothed it, and all this led to no other use of my person, or any other liberties whatever, any more than if a distinction of sexes had not existed. Another peculiarity of taste he had, which was to present me with a dozen pairs of the whitest kid gloves at a time. These he would divert himself with drawing on me, and then biting off the fingers' ends, all which fooleries of a sickly appetite the old gentleman paid more liberally for than most others did for more essential favours. This lasted till a violent cough, seizing and laying him up, delivered me from this most innocent and insipid trifler, for I never heard more of him after his first retreat. You may be sure a by-job of this sort interfered with no other pursuit or plan of life, which I led in truth, with a modesty and reserve that was less the work of virtue than of exhausted novelty, a glut of pleasure and easy circumstances that made me indifferent to any engagements in which pleasure and profit were not eminently united, and such I could, with less impatience, wait for at the hands of time and fortune, as I was satisfied I could never mend my pennyworths, having evidently been served at the top of market, and even been pampered with dainties. Besides that, in the sacrifice of a few momentary impulses, I found a secret satisfaction in respecting myself, as well as preserving the life and freshness of my complexion. Louisa and Emily did not carry indeed their reserve so high as I did, but still they were far from cheap or abandoned, though two of their adventures seemed to contradict this general character, which, for their singularity, I shall give you in course, beginning first with Emily's. Louisa and she went one night to a ball, the first in a habit of a shepherdess, Emily in that of a shepherd. I saw them in their dresses before they went, and nothing in nature could represent a prettier boy than this last did. Being so fair and well-limbed, they had kept together for some time, when Louisa, meeting an old acquaintance of hers, very cordially gives her companion the drop, and leaves her under the protection of her boy's habit, which was not much, and of her discretion, which was, it seems, still less. Emily, finding herself deserted, sauntered thoughtless about a while, and as much for coolness and air as anything else, at length pulled off her mask and went to the sideboard, where, eyed and marked out by a gentleman in a very handsome domino, she was accosted by, and fell into chat with him. The domino, after a little discourse in which Emily doubtless distinguished her good nature and easiness more than her wit, began to make violent love to her, and drawing her insensibly to some benches at the lower end of the masquerade room for her to sit by him, where he squeezed her hands, pinched her cheeks, praised and played with her fine hair, admired her complexion, and all in a style of courtship dashed with a certain oddity, that, not comprehending the mystery of, poor Emily attributed to his falling in with the humour of her disguise, and being naturally not the cruellest of her profession, began to incline into a parley on those essentials. But here was the stress of the joke. He took her really for what she appeared to be, a smock-faced boy, and she, forgetting her dress, and of course ranging quite wide of his ideas, took all those addresses to be paid to herself as a woman, which she precisely owed to his not thinking her one. However, this double error was pushed to such a height on both sides, that Emily, who saw nothing in him but a gentleman of distinction, by those points of dress to which his disguise did not extend, warmed too by the wine he had plied her with, and the caresses he had lavished upon her, suffered herself to be persuaded to go to a bagnio with him, and thus, losing sight of Mrs. Cole's cautions, with a blind confidence put herself into his hands, to be carried wherever he pleased. For his part, equally blinded by his wishes, whilst her egregious simplicity favoured his deception more than the most exquisite art could have done. He supposed, no doubt, that he had lighted on some soft simpleton fit for his purpose, or some kept minion broke into his hand, who understood him perfectly well, and entered into his designs. But be that as it would, he led her to a coach, went into it with her, and brought her to a very handsome apartment, with a bed in it. But whether it was a bagnio or not, she could not tell, having spoken to nobody but himself. But when they were alone together, and her enamorado began to proceed to those extremities which instantly discover the sex, she remarked that no description could paint up to the life the mixture of pique, confusion, and disappointment that appeared in his countenance, joined to the mournful exclamation, "By heavens, a woman!" This at once opened her eyes, which had hitherto been shut in downright stupidity. However, as if he had meant to retrieve that escape, he still continued to toy with and fondle her, but with so staring an alteration from extreme warmth into a chill and forced civility, that even Emily herself could not but take notice of it, and now began to wish she had paid more regard to Mrs. Cole's premonitions against ever engaging with a stranger. And now an excess of timidity succeeded to an excess of confidence, and she thought herself so much at his mercy and discretion that she stood passive throughout the whole progress of his prelude. For now, whether the impressions of so great a beauty had even made him forgive her sex, or whether her appearance in figure in that dress still humoured his first illusion, he recovered by degrees a good part of his first warmth, and keeping Emily with her breeches still unbuttoned, stripped them down to her knees, and gently impelling her to lean down, with her face against the bedside, placed her so that the double way, between the double rising behind, presented the choice fair to him, and he was so fairly set in a misdirection as to give the girl no small alarms for fear of losing a maidenhead she had not dreamt of. However, her complaints, and a resistance, gentle but firm, checked and brought him to himself again, so that turning his steed's head, he drove him at length in the right road, in which his imagination having probably made the most of those resemblances that flattered his taste, he got, with much ado, to his journey's end, after which he led her out himself, and walking with her 2 or 3 streets' length, got her a chair, when making her a present not anything inferior to what she could have expected, he left her, well recommended to the chairman, who, on her directions, brought her home. This she related to Mrs. Cole and me the same morning, not without the visible remains of the fear and confusion she had been in still stamped on her countenance. Mrs. Cole's remark was that her indiscretion proceeding from a constitutional facility, there were little hopes of anything curing her of it, but repeated severe experience. Mine was that I could not conceive how it was possible for mankind to run into a taste not only universally odious, but absurd, and impossible to gratify, since, according to the notions and experience I had of things, it was not in nature to force such immense disproportions. Mrs. Cole only smiled at my ignorance, and said nothing towards my undeception, which was not affected but by ocular demonstration some months after, which a most singular accident furnished me, and which I will here set down, that I may not return again to so disagreeable a subject. I had, on a visit intended to Harriet, who had taken lodgings at Hampton Court, hired a chariot to go out thither, Mrs. Cole having promised to accompany me, but some indispensable business intervening to detain her, I was obliged to set out alone, and scarce had I got a third of my way before the axle tree broke down, and I was well off to get out, safe and unhurt, into a public house of a tolerable handsome appearance on the road. Here the people told me that the stage would come by, in a couple of hours at farthest, upon which, determining to wait for it, sooner than lose the jaunt I had got so far forward on, I was carried into a very clean, decent room, up one pair of stairs, which I took possession of for the time I had to stay, in right of calling for sufficient to do the house justice. Here, whilst I was amusing myself with looking out of the window, a single horse chaise stopped at the door, out of which lightly leaped two gentlemen, for so they seemed, who came in only as it were to bait and refresh a little, for they gave their horse to be held in readiness against they came out. And presently I heard the door of the next room, where they were let in, and called about them briskly, and as soon as they were served, I could just hear that they shut and fastened the door on the inside. A spirit of curiosity, far from sudden, since I do not know when I was without it, prompted me, without any particular suspicion or other drift or view, to see what they were and examine their persons and behaviour. The partition of our rooms was one of those movable ones that, when taken down, served occasionally to lay them into one, for the conveniency of a large company. And now my nicest search could not show me the shadow of a peephole, a circumstance which probably had not escaped the review of the parties on the other side, whom much it stood upon not to be deceived in it. But at length I observed a paper patch of the same colour as the wainscot, which I took to conceal some flaw, but then it was so high that I was obliged to stand upon a chair to reach it, which I did as softly as possibly, and with the point of a bodkin soon pierced it. And now, applying my eye close, I commanded the room perfectly, and could see my two young sparks romping and pulling one another about entirely to my imagination in frolic and innocent play. The eldest might be, on my nearest guess, towards 19, a tall, comely young man in a white fustian frock, with a green velvet cape and a cut bob wig. The youngest could not be above 17, fair, ruddy, completely well made, and to say the truth, a sweet, pretty stripling he was. I fancy too a country lad by his dress, which was a green plush frock and breeches of the same, white waistcoat and stockings, a jockey cap, with his yellowish hair long and loose in natural curls. But after a look of circumspection, which I saw the elder cast every way round the room, probably in too much hurry and heat not to overlook the very small opening I was posted at, especially at the height it was, whilst my eye close to it kept the light from shining through and betraying it, he said something to his companion, and presently changed the face of things. For now the elder began to embrace, to press and kiss the younger, to put his hands into his bosom, and give him such manifest signs of an amorous intention as made me conclude the other to be a girl in disguise, a mistake that nature kept me in countenance for she had certainly made one when she gave him the male stamp. In the rashness then of their age, and bent as they were to accomplish their project of preposterous pleasure, at the risk of the very worst of consequences, where a discovery was nothing less than improbable, they now proceeded to such lengths as soon satisfied me what they were. The criminal scene they acted, I had the patience to see to an end, purely that I might gather more facts and certainty against them in my design to do their deserts instant justice, and accordingly, when they had readjusted themselves and were preparing to go out, burning as I was with rage and indignation, I jumped down from the chair in order to raise the house upon them, but with such an unlucky impetuosity that some nail or ruggedness in the floor caught my foot, and flung me on my face with such violence that I fell senseless on the ground, and must have lain there some time ere any one came to my relief, so that they, alarmed, I suppose, by the noise of my fall, had more than the necessary time to make a safe retreat. This they effected, as I learned, with a precipitation nobody could account for, till, when come to myself and composed enough to speak, I acquainted those of the house with the whole transaction I had been evidence to. When I came home again and told Mrs. Cole this adventure, she very sensibly observed to me that there was no doubt of due vengeance one time or other overtaking these miscreants, however they might escape for the present, and that, had I been the temporal instrument of it, I should have been at least put to a great deal more trouble and confusion than I imagined. That as to the thing itself, the less said of it was the better, but that though she might be suspected of partiality from its being the common cause of womankind, out of whose mouths this practice tended to take something more than bread, yet she protested against any mixture of passion, with a declaration extorted from her by pure regard to truth, which was that whatever effect this infamous passion had in other ages and other countries, it seemed a peculiar blessing on our air and climate, that there was a plague spot visibly imprinted on all that are tainted with it, in this nation at least, for that among numbers of that stamp whom she had known, or at least were universally under the scandalous suspicion of it, she would not name an exemption hardly of one of them whose character was not, in all other respects, the most worthless and despicable that could be, stripped of all the manly virtues of their own sex, and filled up with only the worst vices and follies of ours, that, in fine, they were scarce less execrable than ridiculous in their monstrous inconsistence of loathing and condemning women, and all at the same time aping all their manners, air, lips, scuttle, and in general all their little modes of affectation, which become them at least better than they do these unsexed male misses. But here, washing my hands of them, I replunge into the stream of my history, into which I may very properly engraft a terrible sally of Louisa's, since I had some share in it myself, and have besides engaged myself to relate it, in point of countenance to poor Emily. It will add, too, one more example to thousands, in confirmation of the maxim, that when women get once out of compass, there are no lengths of licentiousness that they are not capable of running. One morning then that both Mrs. Cole and Emily were gone out for the day, and only Louisa and I, not to mention the housemaid, were left in charge of the house, whilst we were loitering away the time in looking through the shop windows, the son of a poor woman, who earned very hard bread indeed by mending stockings in a stall in the neighbourhood, offered us some nosegays, ringed around a small basket, by selling of which the poor boy eked out his mother's maintenance of them both. Nor was he fit for any other way of livelihood, since he was not only a perfect changeling, or idiot, but stammered so that there was no understanding even those sounds his half-dozen, at most, animal ideas prompted him to utter. The boys and servants in the neighbourhood had given him the nickname of Good-natured Dick, from the soft simpleton's doing everything he was bid at the first word, and from his naturally having no turn to mischief. Then, by the way, he was perfectly well made, stout, clean-limbed, tall of his age, as strong as a horse, and, withal, pretty featured, so that he was not, absolutely, such a figure to be snuffled at neither, if your nicety could, in favour of such essentials, have dispensed with a face unwashed, hair tangled for want of combing, and so ragged a plight, that he might have disputed points of show with e'er a heathen philosopher of them all. This boy we had often seen, and bought his flowers out of pure compassion and nothing more, but just at this time as he stood presenting us his basket, a sudden whim, a start of wayward fancy, seized Louisa, and without consulting me she calls him in, and beginning to examine his nosegays, culls out two, one for herself, another for me, and pulling out half a crown, very currently gives it him to change, as if she had really expected he could have changed it. But the boy, scratching his head, made his signs, explaining his inability in place of words, which he could not, with all his struggling, articulate. Louisa at this says, "Well, my lad, come upstairs with me, and I will give you your due," winking at the same time to me, and beckoning me to accompany her, which I did, securing first the street door, that by this means, together with the shop, became wholly the care of the faithful housemaid. As we went up, Louisa whispered to me that she had conceived a strange longing to be satisfied whether the general rule held good with regard to this changeling, and how far nature had made him amends, in her best bodily gifts, for her denial of the sublimer intellectual ones, begging at the same time my assistance in procuring her this satisfaction. A want of complaisance was never my vice, and I was so far from opposing this extravagant frolic, that now, bit with the same maggot, and my curiosity conspiring with hers, I entered plumb into it on my own account. Consequently, as soon as we came into Louisa's bedchamber, whilst she was amusing him with picking out his nosegays, I undertook the lead, and began the attack. As it was not then very material to keep much measures with a mere natural, I made presently very free with him, though at my first motion of meddling, his surprise and confusion made him receive my advances but awkwardly, nay, insomuch that he bashfully shied, and shied back a little, till encouraging him with my eyes, plucking him playfully by the hair, sleeking his cheeks, and forwarding my point by a number of little wantonnesses, I soon turned him familiar, and gave nature her sweetest alarm, so that, aroused and beginning to feel himself we could, amidst all the innocent laugh and grin I had provoked him into, perceive the fire lighting in his eyes, and, diffusing over his cheeks, blend its glow with that of his blushes. The emotion, in short, of animal pleasure, glared distinctly in the simpleton's countenance. Yet, struck with the novelty of the scene, he did not know which way to look or move, but tame, passive, simpering, with his mouth half open in stupid rapture, stood and tractably suffered me to do what I pleased with him. His basket was dropped out of his hands, which Louisa took care of. I had now, through more than one rent, discovered and felt his thighs, the skin of which seemed the smoother and fairer for the coarseness and even dirt of his dress, as the teeth of negroes seem the whiter for the surrounding black, and poor indeed of habit, poor of understanding, he was, however, abundantly rich in personal treasures, such as the flesh, firm, plump, and replete with the juices of youth, and robust, well-knit limbs. My fingers too had now got within reach of the true, the genuine sensitive plant, which, instead of shrinking from the touch, joys to meet it, and swells and vegetates under it. Mine pleasingly informed me that matters were so ripe for the discovery we meditated, that they were too mighty for the confinement they were ready to break. A waistband that I unskewered, and a rag of a shirt that I removed, and which could not have covered a quarter of it, revealed the whole of the idiot's standard of distinction, erect, in full pride and display, but such a one! It was positively of so tremendous a size, that prepared as we were to see something extraordinary, it still, out of measure, surpassed our expectation, and astonished even me, who had not been used to trade in trifles. In fine, it might have answered very well the making a show of. Its enormous head seemed, in hue and size, not unlike a common sheep's heart. Then you might have trolled dice securely along the broad back of the body of it. The length of it, too, was prodigious. Then the rich appendage of the treasure bag beneath, large in proportion, gathered and crisped up round in shallow furrows, helped to fill the eye and complete the proof of his being a natural, not quite in vain, since it was full manifest that he inherited, and largely too, the prerogative of majesty which distinguishes that otherwise most unfortunate condition, and gives rise to the vulgar saying, "A fool's bauble is a lady's playfellow." Not wholly without reason, for, generally speaking, it is in love as it is in war, where longest weapon carries it. Nature, in short, had done so much for him in those parts, that she perhaps held herself acquitted in doing so little for his head. For my part, who had sincerely no intention to push the joke further than simply satisfying my curiosity with the sight of it alone, I was content, in spite of the temptation that stared me in the face, with having raised a maypole for another to hang a garland on, for by this time, easily reading Louisa's desires in her wishful eyes, I acted the commodious part and made her, who sought no better sport, significant terms of encouragement to go through stitch with her adventure, intimating, too, that I would stay and see fair play, in which, indeed, I had in view to humour a newborn curiosity to observe what appearances active nature would put on in a natural in the course of this her darling operation. Louisa, whose appetite was up, and who, like the industrious bee, was, it seems, not above gathering the sweets of so rare a flower, though she found it planted on a dunghill, was but too readily disposed to take the benefit of my cession. Urged then strongly by her own desires, and emboldened by me, she presently determined to risk a trial of parts with the idiot, who was by this time nobly inflamed for her purpose, by all the irritations we had used to put the principles of pleasure effectually into motion, and to wind up the springs of its organ to their supreme pitch, and it stood accordingly stiff and straining, ready to burst with the blood and spirits that swelled it to a bulk. No, I shall never forget it. Louisa then, taking and holding the fine handle that so invitingly offered itself, led the ductile youth by that master tool of his, as she stepped backwards towards the bed, which he joyfully gave way to, under the incitations of instinct, and palpably delivered up to the goad of desire. Stopped then by the bed, she took the fall she loved, and leaned to the most gently backward upon it, still holding fast what she held, and taking care to give her clothes a convenient toss-up, so that her thighs, duly disclosed and elevated, laid open all the outward prospect of the treasury of love, the rose-lipped overture presenting the cockpit so fair that it was not in nature even for a natural to miss it. Nor did he, for Louisa, fully bent on grappling with it, and impatience of dalliance or delay, directed faithfully the point of the battering piece, and bounded up with a rage of so voracious appetite, to meet and favour the thrust of insertion, that the fierce activity on both sides effected it with such pain of distension that Louisa cried out violently that she was hurt beyond bearing, that she was killed. But it was too late. The storm was up, and force was on her to give way to it, for now the man-machine, strongly worked upon by the sensual passion, felt so manfully his advantages and superiority, felt withal the sting of pleasure so intolerable, that maddening with it, his joys began to assume a character of furiousness, which made me tremble for the too tender Louisa. He seemed, at this juncture, greater than himself. His countenance, before so void of meaning or expression, now grew big with the importance of the act he was upon. In short, it was not now that he was to be played the fool with. But what is pleasant enough, I myself was awed into a sort of respect for him by the comely terrors his motions dressed him in. His eyes shooting sparks of fire, his face glowing with ardours that gave another life to it, his teeth churning, his whole frame agitated with a raging ungovernable impetuosity, all sensibly betraying the formidable fierceness with which the genial instinct acted upon him. Butting then and goring all before him, and mad and wild like an over-driven steer, he ploughs up the tender furrow, all insensible to Louisa's complaints. Nothing can stop, nothing can keep out a fury like this, with which, having once got its head in, its blind rage soon made way for the rest, piercing, rending, and breaking open all obstructions. The torn, split, wounded girl cries, struggles, invokes me to her rescue, and endeavours to get from under the young savage, or shake him off, but alas, in vain. Her breath might as soon have stilled or stemmed a storm in winter, as all her strength have quelled his rough assault, or put him out of his course. And indeed all her efforts and struggles were managed with such disorder that they served rather to entangle and fold her the faster in the twine of his boisterous arms, so that she was tied to the stake and obliged to fight the match out if she died for it. For his part, instinct-ridden as he was, the expressions of his animal passion, partaking something of ferocity, were rather worrying than kisses, intermixed with eager, ravenous love-bites on her cheeks and neck, the prints of which did not wear out for some days after. Poor Louisa, however, bore up at length better than could have been expected, and though she suffered, and greatly too, yet, ever true to the good old cause, she suffered with pleasure and enjoyed her pain. And soon now, by dint of an enraged enforcement, the brute machine, driven like a whirlwind, made all smoke again, and wedging its way up to the utmost extremity, left her, in point of penetration, nothing to fear or to desire. And now, gorged with the dearest morsel of the earth. Shakespeare. Louisa lay, pleased to the heart, pleased to her utmost capacity of being so, with every fibre in those parts stretched almost to breaking, on a rack of joy, whilst the instrument of all this overfullness searched her senses with its sweet excess, till the pleasure gained upon her so, its point stung her so home, that catching at length the rage from her furious driver, and sharing the riot of his wild rapture, she went wholly out of her mind into that favourite part of her body, the whole intenseness of which was so fervously filled and employed. There alone she existed, all lost in those delirious transports, those ecstasies of the senses, which her winking eyes, the brightened vermilion of her lips and cheeks, and sighs of pleasure deeply fetched, so pathetically expressed. In short, she was now as mere a machine as much wrought on, and had her motions as little at her own command as the natural himself, who thus broke in upon her, made her feel with a vengeance his tempestuous tenderness, and the force of the metal he battered with. Their active loins quivered again with the violence of their conflict, till the surge of pleasure, foaming and raging to a height, drew down the pearly shower that was to allay this hurricane. The purely sensitive idiot then first shed those tears of joy that attend its last moments, not without an agony of delight, and even almost a roar of rapture. As the gush escaped him, so sensibly too for Louisa, that she kept him faithful company, going off in consent with the old symptoms, a delicious delirium, a tremulous convulsive shudder, and the critical dying. Oh! And now, on his getting off, she lay pleasure-drenched and regorging its essential sweets, but quite spent and gasping for breath, without other sensation of life than in those exquisite vibrations that trembled yet on the strings of delight, which had been too intensively touched, and which nature had been so intensely stirred with, for the senses to be quickly at peace from. As for the changeling, whose curious engine had been thus successfully played off, his shift of countenance and gesture had even something droll, or rather tragicomic in it. There was now an air of sad repining foolishness superadded to his natural one of no meaning and idiotism, as he stood with his label of manhood, now lank, unstiffened, becalmed, and flapping against his thighs, down which it reached half-way, terrible even in its fall, whilst under the dejection of spirit and flesh, which naturally followed, his eyes by turns, cast down towards his struck standard, or piteously lifted to Louisa, seemed to require at her hands what he had so sensibly parted from to her, and now ruefully missed. But the vigour of nature soon returning, dissipated the blast of faintness which the common law of enjoyment had subjected him to, and now his basket re-became his main concern, which I looked for and brought him, whilst Louisa restored his dress to its usual condition, and afterwards pleased him perhaps more by taking all his flowers off his hands, and paying him at his rate for them, than if she had embarrassed him by a present that he would have been puzzled to account for, and might have put others on tracing the motives of. Whether she ever returned to the attack I know not, and to say the truth, I believe not. She had had her freak out, and had pretty plentifully drowned her curiosity in a glut of pleasure, which, as it happened, had no other consequence than that the lad, who retained only a confused memory of the transaction, would, when he saw her, for some time after, express a grin of joy and familiarity, after his idiot manner, and soon forgot her in favour of the next woman, tempted, on the report of his parts, to take him in. End of Section 9. Section 10 of Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure by John CLELAND. Letter the Second, Part 10. Louisa herself did not long outstay this adventure at Mrs. Cole's, to whom, by the by, we took care not to boast of our exploit till all fear of consequences were clearly over, for an occasion presenting itself of proving her passion for a young fellow at the expense of her discretion, proceeding all in character, she packed up her toilet at half a day's warning and went with him abroad, since which I entirely lost sight of her, and it never fell in my way to hear what became of her. But a few days after she had left us, two very pretty young gentlemen, who were Mrs. Cole's especial favourites and free of her academy, easily obtained her consent for Emily's and my acceptance of a party of pleasure at a little but agreeable house belonging to one of them, situated not far up the river Thames, on the Surrey side. Everything being settled, and it being a fine summer day, but rather of the warmest, we set out after dinner and got to our rendezvous about 4 in the afternoon, where, landing at the foot of a neat, joyous pavilion, Emily and I were handed into it by our squires, and there drank tea with a cheerfulness and gaiety that the beauty of the prospect, the serenity of the weather, and the tender politeness of our sprightly gallants naturally led us into. After tea, and taking a turn in the garden, my particular, who was the master of the house, and had in no sense schemed this party of pleasure for a dry one, proposed to us with that frankness which his familiarity at Mrs. Cole's entitled him to, as the weather was excessively hot, to bathe together, under a commodious shelter that he had prepared expressly for that purpose, in a creek of the river, with which a side door of the pavilion immediately communicated, and where we might be sure of having our diversion out, safe from interruption, and with the utmost privacy. Emily, who never refused anything, and I, who ever delighted in bathing, and had no exception to the person who proposed it, or to those pleasures it was easy to guess it implied, took care on this occasion not to wrong our training at Mrs. Cole's, and agreed to it with as good a grace as we could. Upon which, without loss of time, we returned instantly to the pavilion, one door of which opened into a tent pitched before it, that, with its marquees, formed a pleasing defence against the sun or the weather, and was besides as private as we could wish. The lining of it, embossed cloth, represented a wild forest foliage from the top down to the sides, which, in the same stuff, were figured with fluted pilasters, with their spaces between filled with flower vases, the whole having a gay effect upon the eye wherever you turned it. Then it reached sufficiently into the water, yet contained convenient benches round it, on the dry ground, either to keep our clothes or, in short, for more uses than resting upon. There was a side table too, loaded with sweetmeats, jellies, and other eatables, and bottles of wine and cordials by way of occasional relief from any rawness or chill of the water, or from any faintness from whatever cause, and in fact, my gallant, who understood cheer and tire perfectly, and who, for taste, even if you would not approve this specimen of it, might have been comptroller of pleasures to a Roman emperor, had left no requisite towards convenience or luxury unprovided. As soon as we had looked round this inviting spot, and every preliminary of privacy was duly settled, strip was the word. when the young gentleman soon dispatched the undressing each his partner and reduced us to the naked confession of all those secrets of person which dress generally hides, and which the discovery of was, naturally speaking, not to our disadvantage. Our hands, indeed, mechanically carried towards the most interesting part of us, screened at first all from the tufted cliff downwards, till we took them away at their desire, and employed them in doing them the same office of helping off with their clothes, in the process of which there passed all the little wantonnesses and frolics that you may easily imagine. As for my spark, he was presently undressed, all to his shirt, the fore lappet of which, as he leaned languishingly on me, he smilingly pointed to me to observe, as it bellied out or rose and fell according to the unruly starts of the motion behind it. But it was soon fixed, for now taking off his shirt, and naked as a cupid, he showed it me at so upright a stand, as prepared me indeed for his application to me for instant ease. But though the sight of its fine size was fit enough to fire me, the cooling air, as I stood in this state of nature, joined to the desire I had of bathing first, enabled me to put him off, and tranquillize him, with the remark that a little suspense would only set a keener edge on the pleasure. Leading then the way, and showing our friends an example of continency which they were giving signs of losing respect to, we went hand in hand into the stream, till it took us up to our neck, where the no more than graceful coolness of the water gave my senses a delicious refreshment from the sultriness of the season, and made more alive, more happy in myself, and in course, more alert and open to voluptuous impressions. Here I laved and wantoned with the water, or sportively played with my companion, leaving Emily to deal with hers at discretion. Mine, at length, not content with making me take the plunge over head and ears, kept splashing me, and provoking me with all the little playful tricks he could devise, and which I strove not to remain in his debt for. We gave, in short, a loose to mirth, and now nothing would serve him but giving his hands the regale of going over every part of me, neck, breast, belly, thighs, and all the etc., so dear to the imagination, under the pretext of washing and rubbing them, as we both stood in the water, no higher now than the pit of our stomachs, and which did not hinder him from feeling and toying with that leak that distinguishes our sex, and it's so wonderfully watertight, for his fingers, in vain dilating and opening it, only let more flame than water into it, be it said without a figure. At the same time he made me feel his own engine, which was so well wound up as to stand even the working in water, and he accordingly threw one arm round my neck, and was endeavouring to get the better of that harsher construction, bred by the surrounding fluid, and had in effect won his way so far as to make me sensible of the pleasing stretch of those nether lips from the in-driving machine, when, independent of my not liking that awkward mode of enjoyment, I could not help interrupting him in order to become joint spectators of a plan of joy in hot operation between Emily and her partner, who, impatient of the fooleries and dalliance of the bath, had led his nymph to one of the benches on the green bank, where he was very cordially proceeding to teach her the difference betwixt jest and earnest. There, setting her on his knee, and gliding one hand over the surface of that smooth, polished, snow-white skin of hers, which now doubly shone with a dew-bright lustre, and presented to the touch something like what one would imagine of animated ivory, especially in those ruby-nippled globes, which the touch is so fond of and delights to make love to. With the other he was lusciously exploring the sweet secret of nature, in order to make room for a stately piece of machinery that stood upreared between her thighs, as she continued sitting on his lap, and pressed hard for instant admission, which the tender Emily, in a fit of humour deliciously protracted, affecting to decline, and elude the very pleasure she sighed for, but in a style of waywardness so prettily put on and managed as to render it 10 times more poignant. Then her eyes, all amidst the softest dying languishment, expressed at once a mock denial and extreme desire, whilst her sweetness was zested with a coyness so pleasingly provoking. Her moods of keeping him off were so attractive that they redoubled impetuous rage with which he covered her with kisses, and the kisses that, whilst she seemed to shy from or scuffle for, the cunning wanton contrived such sly returns of as were doubtless the sweeter for the gust she gave them of being stolen ravished. Thus Emily, who knew no art but that which nature itself, in favour of her principal end, pleasure, had inspired her with, the art of yielding, coyed it indeed, but coyed it to the purpose, for with all her straining, her wrestling, and striving to break from the clasp of his arms, she was so far wiser yet than to mean it, that in her struggles it was visible she aimed at nothing more than multiplying points of touch with him, and drawing yet closer the folds that held them everywhere entwined, like 2 tendrils of a vine intercurling together, so that the same effect as when Louisa strove in good earnest to disengage from the idiot was now produced by different motives. Meanwhile, their immersion out of the cold water had caused a general glow, a tender suffusion of heightened carnation over their bodies, both equally white and smooth-skinned, so that as their limbs were thus amorously interwoven in sweet confusion, it was scarce possible to distinguish who they respectively belonged to, but for the brawnier, bolder muscles of the stronger sex. In a little time, however, the champion was fairly in with her, and had tied at all points the true lover's knot, when now, adieu all the little refinements of a finessed reluctance, adieu the friendly feint, she was presently driven forcibly out of the power of using any art, and indeed, what art must not give way, when nature, corresponding with her assailant, invaded in the heart of her capital, and carried by storm, lay at the mercy of the proud conqueror who had made his entry triumphantly and completely. Soon, however, to become a tributary, for the engagement growing hotter and hotter, at close quarters she presently brought him to the pass of paying down the dear debt to nature, which she had no sooner collected in but, like a duellist who has laid his antagonist at his feet, when he has himself received a mortal wound, Emily had scarce time to plume herself upon her victory, but, shot with the same discharge, she, in a loud expiring sigh, in the closure of her eyes, the stretch out of her limbs, and a remission of her whole frame, gave manifest signs that all was as it should be. For my part, who had not with the calmest patience stood in the water all this time to view this warm action, I leaned tenderly on my gallant, and at the close of it seemed to ask him with my eyes what he thought of it. But he, more eager to satisfy me by his actions than by his words or looks, as we shoaled the water towards the shore, showed me the staff of love so intensely set up, that had not even charity beginning at home in this case, urged me to our mutual relief, it would have been cruel indeed to have suffered the youth to burst with straining, when the remedy was so obvious and so near at hand. Accordingly, we took to a bench, whilst Emily and her spark, who belonged it seems to the sea, stood at a sideboard, drinking to our good voyage. For, as the last observed, we were well under way, with a fair wind up channel, and full freighted. Nor indeed were we long before we finished our trip to Cythera, and unloaded in the old haven, but, as the circumstances did not admit of much variation, I shall spare you the description. At the same time, allow me to place you here an excuse I am conscious of owing you, for having, perhaps, too much affected the figurative style, though surely it can pass nowhere more allowably than in a subject which is so properly the province of poetry, nay, is poetry itself, pregnant with every flower of imagination and loving metaphors. even were not the natural expressions, for respects of fashion and sound necessarily forbid it. Resuming now my history, you may please to know that what with a competent number of repetitions, all in the same strain, and by the by, we have a certain natural sense that those repetitions are very much to the taste. What with a circle of pleasures delicately varied, there was not a moment lost to joy all the time we stayed there. Till late in the night we were re-escorted home by our squires, who delivered us safe to Mrs. Cole, with generous thanks for our company. This too was Emily's last adventure in our way, for scarce a week after, she was, by an accident too trivial to detail to you the particulars, found out by her parents, who were in good circumstances, and who had been punished for their partiality to their son, in the loss of him, occasioned by a circumstance of their overindulgence to his appetite, upon which the so long engrossed stream of fondness running violently in favour of this lost and inhumanly abandoned child, whom they had not neglected enquiry about, they might long before have recovered. They were now so overjoyed at the retrieval of her that, I presume, it made them much less strict in examining the bottom of things, for they seemed very glad to take for granted in the lump everything that the grave and decent Mrs. Cole was pleased to pass upon them, and soon afterwards sent her from the country a handsome acknowledgment. But it was not so easy to replace to our community the loss of so sweet a member of it, for, not to mention her beauty, she was one of those mild, pliant characters that if one does not entirely esteem, one can scarce help loving, which is not such a bad compensation neither. Owing all her weakness to good nature and an indolent facility that kept her too much at the mercy of first impressions, she had just sense enough to know that she wanted leading strings, and thought herself so much obliged to any who would take the pains to think for her and guide her, that with very little management she was capable of being made a most agreeable, nay, a most virtuous wife, for vice, it is probable, had never been her choice, or her fate, if it had not been for occasion, or example, or had she not depended less upon herself than upon her circumstances. This presumption her conduct afterwards verified, for presently meeting with a match that was ready cut and dry for her, with a neighbour's son of her own rank, and a young man of sense and order, who took her as the widow of one lost at sea, for so it seems one of her gallants, whose name she had made free with, really was, she naturally struck into all the duties of their domestic life with as much constancy and regularity as if she had never swerved from a state of undebauched innocence from her youth. These desertions had, however, now so far thinned Mrs. Cole's brood, that she was left with only me, like a hen with one chicken. But though she was earnestly entreated and encouraged to recruit her corps, her growing infirmities, and, above all, the tortures of a stubborn hip-gout, which she found would yield to no remedy, determined her to bread up her business and retire with a decent pittance into the country, where I promised myself nothing so sure as my going down to live with her as soon as I had seen a little more of life, and improved my small matters into a competency that would create in me an independence on the world. For I was now, thanks to Mrs. Cole, wise enough to keep that essential in view. Thus was I then to lose my faithful preceptress, as did the philosophers of the town the white crow of her profession. For besides that she never ransacked her customers, whose taste too she ever studiously consulted, besides that she never racked her pupils with unconscionable extortions, nor ever put their hard earnings, as she called them, under the contribution of poundage, she was a severe enemy to the seduction for innocence, and confined her acquisitions solely to those unfortunate young women who, having lost it, were but the juster objects of compassion. Among these, indeed, she picked but such as suited her views, and taking them under her protection, rescued them from the danger of the public sinks of ruin and misery, to place or do for them, well or ill, in the manner you have seen." Having then settled her affairs, she set out on her journey, after taking the most tender leave of me, and at the end of some excellent instructions, recommending me to myself, with an anxiety perfectly maternal. In short, she affected me so much, that I was not presently reconciled to myself for suffering her at any rate to go without me, but fate had, it seems, otherwise disposed of me. I had, on my separation from Mrs. Cole, taken a pleasant, convenient house at Marylebone, but easy to rent and manage from its smallness, which I furnished neatly and modestly. There, with a reserve of £800, the fruit of my deference to Mrs. Cole's counsels, exclusive of clothes, some jewels, some plate, I saw myself in purse for a long time, to wait without impatience for what the chapter of accidents might produce in my favour. Here, under the new character of a young gentlewoman whose husband was gone to sea, I had marked me out such lines of life and conduct as, leaving me at a competent liberty to pursue my views either out of pleasure or fortune, bounded me nevertheless strictly within the rules of decency and discretion, a disposition in which you cannot escape observing a true pupil of Mrs. Cole. I was scarce, however, well warm in my new abode, when going out one morning pretty early to enjoy the freshness of it, in the pleasing outlet of the fields, accompanied only by a maid whom I had newly hired. As we were carelessly walking among the trees we were alarmed with the noise of a violent coughing, turning our heads towards which, we distinguished a plain, well-dressed, elderly gentleman, who, attacked with a sudden fit, was so much overcome as to be forced to give way to it and sit down at the foot of a tree, where he seemed suffocating with the severity of it, being perfectly black in the face. Not less moved than frightened, with which I flew on the instant to his relief, and using the rote of practice I had observed on the like occasion, I loosened his cravat and clapped him on the back, but whether to any purpose or whether the cough had had its course I know not. But the fit immediately went off, and now recovered to his speech and legs, he returned me thanks with as much emphasis as if I had saved his life. This naturally engaging a conversation, he acquainted me where he lived, which was at a considerable distance from where I met with him, and where he had strayed insensibly on the same intention of a morning walk. He was, as I afterwards learned in the course of this intimacy which this little accident gave birth to, an old bachelor turned of 60, but of a fresh vigorous complexion, insomuch that he scarce marked 45, having never racked his constitution by permitting his desires to overtax his ability. As to his birth and condition, his parents, honest and failed mechanics, had, by the best traces he could get of them, left him an infant orphan on the parish, so that it was from a charity school that, by honesty and industry, he made his way into a merchant's counting house, from whence, being sent to a house in Cadiz, he there by his talents and activity acquired a fortune, but an immense one, with which he returned to his native country, where he could not, however, so much as fish out one single relation out of the obscurity he was born in. Taking then a taste for retirement, and pleased to enjoy life like a mistress in the dark, he flowed his days in all the ease of opulence, without the least parade of it, and, rather studying the concealment than the show of a fortune, looked down on a world he perfectly knew, himself to his wish unknown and unmarked by. But as I propose to devote a letter entirely to the pleasure of retracing to you all the particulars of my acquaintance with this ever, to me, memorable friend, I shall in this transiently touch on no more than may serve as mortar to cement to form the connection of my history, and to obviate your surprise that one of my high blood and relish of life should count a gallant of 80 such a catch. Referring then to a more explicit narrative, to explain by what progressions our acquaintance, certainly innocent at first, insensibly changed nature and ran into unplatonic lengths, as might well be expected from one of my condition of life. and above all from that principle of electricity that scarce ever fails of producing fire when the sexes meet. I shall only here acquaint you that as age had not subdued his tenderness for our sex, neither had it robbed him of the power of pleasing, since whatever he wanted in the bewitching charms of youth, he atoned for or supplemented with the advantages of experience, the sweetness of his manners, and above all his flattering address in touching the heart by an application to the understanding. From him it was I first learned, to any purpose, and not without infinite pleasure, that I had such a portion of me worth bestowing some regard on. From him I received my first essential encouragement, and instructions how to put it in that train of cultivation, which I have since pushed to the little degree of improvement you see it at. He it was who first taught me to be sensible, that the pleasures of the mind were superior to those of the body. At the same time, that they were so far from obnoxious to, or incompatible with each other that, besides the sweetness in the variety and transition, the one served to exalt and perfect the taste of the other to a degree that the senses alone can never arrive at. Himself a rational pleasurist, as being much too wise to be ashamed of the pleasures of humanity, loved me indeed, but loved me with dignity, in a mien equally removed from the sourness of forwardness by which age is unpleasingly characterized, and from that childish silly dotage that so often disgraces it, and which he himself used to turn into ridicule and compare to an old goat affecting the frisk of a young kid. In short, everything that is generally unamiable in his season of life was, in him, repaired by so many advantages, that he existed a proof manifest at least to me, that it is not out of the power of age to please, if it lays out to please, and if, making just allowances, those in that class do not forget that it must cost them more pains and attention than what youth, the natural springtime of joy, stands in need of, as fruits out of season require proportionably more skill and cultivation to force them. With this gentleman, then, who took me home soon after our acquaintance commenced, I lived near 8 months, in which time my constant complaisance and docility, my attention to deserve his confidence and love, and a conduct, in general, devoid of the least art and founded on my sincere regard and esteem for him, won and attached him so firmly to me, that after having generously trusted me with a genteel, independent settlement, proceeding to heap marks of affection on me, he appointed me, by an authentic will, his sole heiress and executrix, a disposition which he did not outlive 2 months, being taken from me by a violent cold that he contracted as he unadvisedly ran to the window on an alarm of fire, at some street's distance, and stood there naked-breasted and exposed to the fatal impressions of a damp night air. After acquitting myself of my duty towards my deceased benefactor, and paying him a tribute of unfeigned sorrow, which a little time changed into a most tender, grateful memory of him that I shall ever retain, I grew somewhat comforted by the prospect that now opened to me, if not of happiness, at least of affluence and independence. I saw myself then in the full bloom and pride of youth, for I was not yet 19, actually at the head of so large a fortune, as it would have been even the height of impudence in me to have raised my wishes, much more my hopes too, and that this unexpected elevation did not turn my head, I owed to the pains my benefactor had taken to form and prepare me for it, as I owed his opinion of my management of the vast possessions he left to me to what he had observed of the prudential economy I had learned under Mrs. Cole, of which the reserve he saw I had made was a proof and encouragement to him. But alas, how easily is the enjoyment of the greatest sweets in life, in present possession, poisoned by the regret of an absent one. But my regret was a mighty and just one, since it had my only truly beloved Charles for its object. Given him up I had indeed completely, having never once heard from him since our separation, which, as I found afterwards, had been my misfortune and not his neglect, for he wrote me several letters which had all miscarried, but forgotten him I never had. Amidst all my personal infidelities, not one had made a pin's point impression on a heart impenetrable to the true love passion, but for him. As soon, however, as I was mistress of this unexpected fortune, I felt more than ever how dear he was to me, from its insufficiency to make me happy, whilst he was not to share it with me. My earliest care, consequently, was to endeavour at getting some account of him, but all my researches produced me no more light than that his father had been dead for some time, not so well as even with the world, and that Charles had reached his port of destination in the South Seas, where, finding the estate he was sent to recover dwindled to a trifle by the loss of 2 ships in which the bulk of his uncle's fortune lay, he was come away with a small remainder, and might, perhaps, according to the best advice, in a few months return to England, from whence he had, at the time of this my inquiry, had been absent 2 years and 7 months, a little eternity in love. You cannot conceive with what joy I embraced the hopes thus given me of seeing the delight of my heart again, but as the term of months was assigned it, in order to divert and amuse my impatience for his return, after settling my affairs with much ease and security, I set out on a journey for Lancashire, with an equipage suitable to my fortune, and with a design purely to revisit my place of nativity, for which I could not help retaining a great tenderness, and might naturally not be sorry to show myself there to the advantage I was now in pass to do, after the report Esther Davis had spread of my being spirited away to the plantations, for on no other supposition could she account for the suppression of myself to her, since her leaving me so abruptly at the inn. Another favourite intention I had, to look out for my relations, though I had none besides distant ones, and prove a benefactress to them. Then Mrs. Cole's place of retirement lying in my way was not amongst the least of the pleasures I had proposed to myself in this expedition. I had taken nobody with me but a discreet, decent woman, to figure it as my companion, besides my servants, and was scarce got into an inn about 20 miles from London, where I was to sup and pass the night, when such a storm of wind and rain sprang up as made me congratulate myself on having got under shelter before it began. This had continued a good half-hour, when bethinking me of some directions to give to the coachman, I sent for him, and not caring that his shoes should soil the very clean parlour in which the cloth was laid, I stepped into the hall kitchen where he was, and where, whilst I was talking to him, I slantingly observed 2 horsemen driven in by the weather, and both wringing wet, one of whom was asking if they could not be assisted with a change while their clothes were dried. But heavens! Who can express what I felt at the sound of a voice, ever present to my heart, and that is now rebounded at, or when pointing my eyes towards the person it came from, they confirmed its information, in spite of so long an absence, and of a dress one would have imagined studied for a disguise, a horseman's great coat with a stand-up cape, and his hat flapped. But what could escape the piercing alertness of a sense surely guided by love? A transport then like mine was above all consideration, or schemes of surprise, and I, that instant, with the rapidity of the emotions that I felt the spur of, shot into his arms, crying out, as I threw mine round his neck, "My life! My soul! My Charles!" and without further power of speech, swooned away under the pressing agitations of joy and surprise. Recovered out of my entrancement, I found myself in my charmer's arms, but in the parlour, surrounded by a crowd which this event had gathered round us, and which immediately, on a signal from the discreet landlady, who currently took him for my husband, cleared the room, and desirably left us alone to the raptures of this reunion, my joy at which had like to have proved, at the expense of my life, power superior to that of grief at our fatal separation. The first object then that my eyes opened on was their supreme idol, and my supreme wish Charles, on one knee, holding me fast by the hand, and gazing on me with a transport of fondness. Observing my recovery, he attempted to speak, and give vent to his patience of hearing my voice again, to satisfy him once more that it was me, but the mightiness and suddenness of the surprise, continuing to stun him, choked his utterance. He could only stammer out a few broken, half-formed, faltering accents, which my ears greedily drinking in, spelt, and put together so as to make out their sense. "After so long, so cruel, an absence, my dearest Fanny, can it be you?" Stifling me at the same time with kisses that, stopping my mouth, at once prevented the answer that he panted for, and increased the delicious disorder in which all my senses were rapturously lost. Amidst, however, this crowd of ideas, and all blissful ones, there obtruded only one cruel doubt, that poisoned nearly all the transcendent happiness, and what was it but my dread of its being too excessive to be real? I trembled now with the fear of its being no more than a dream, and of my waking out of it into the horrors of finding it one. Under this fond apprehension, imagining I could not make too much of the present prodigious joy before it should vanish and leave me in the desert again, nor verify its reality too strongly, I clung to him, I clasped him, as if to hinder him from escaping me again. "Where have you been? How could you leave me? Say you are still mine, that you still love me, and thus, kissing him as if I would consolidate lips with him. "I forgive you. Forgive my hard fortune in favor of this restoration." All these interjections breaking from me in that wildness of expression that justly passes for eloquence in love, drew from him all the returns my fond heart could wish or require. Our caresses, our questions, our answers, for some time observed no order, all crossing or interrupting one another in sweet confusion, whilst we exchanged hearts at our eyes, and renewed the ratifications of a love unbated by time or absence. Not a breath, not a motion, not a gesture on either side, but what was strongly impressed with it. Our hands, locked in each other, repeated the most passionate squeezes, so that their fiery thrill went to the heart again. Thus absorbed and concentred in this unutterable delight, I had not attended to the sweet author of it, being thoroughly wet, and in danger of catching cold, when, in good time, the landlady, whom the appearance of my equipage, which, by the by, Charles knew nothing of, had gained me an interest in, for me and mine, interrupted us by bringing in a decent shift of linen and clothes, which now, somewhat recovered into a calmer composure by the coming in of a third person, I pressed him to take the benefit of, with a tender concern and anxiety that made me tremble for his health. The landlady leaving us again, he proceeded to shift, in the act of which, though he proceeded with all that modesty which became these first solemner instants of our re-meeting after so long an absence, I could not contain certain snatches of my eyes, lured by the dazzling discoveries of his naked skin, that escaped him as he changed his linen, and which I could not observe the unfaded life and complexion of without emotions of tenderness and joy, that had himself too purely for their object to partake of a loose or mistimed desire. He was soon dressed in these temporary clothes, which neither fitted him now became the light my passion placed him in, to me at least, yet as they were on him, they looked extremely well, in virtue of that magic charm which love put into everything that he touched, or had relation to him. And where indeed was that dress that a figure like this would not give grace to? For now, as I eyed him more in detail, I could not but observe the even favourable alteration which the time of his absence had produced in his person. There were still the requisite lineaments, still the same vivid vermilion and bloom reigning in his face, but now the roses were more fully blown, the tan of his travels, and a beard somewhat more distinguishable had, at the expense of no more delicacy than what he could well spare, given it an air of becoming manliness and maturity that symmetrized nobly with that air of distinction and empire with which nature had stamped it, in a rare mixture with the sweetness of it. Still nothing had he lost of that smooth plumpness of flesh which, glowing with freshness, blooms florid to the eye and delicious to the touch. Then his shoulders were grown more square, his shape more formed, more portly, but still free and airy. In short, his figure showed riper, greater, and perfecter to the experienced eye than in his tender youth. And now he was not much more than 22. In this interval, however, I picked out of the broken, often pleasingly interrupted account of himself, that he was, at that instant, actually on his road to London, in not a very paramount plight or condition, having been wrecked on the Irish coast, for which he had prematurely embarked, and lost the little all he had brought with him from the South Seas, so that he had not till after great shifts and hardships, in the company of his fellow traveller the captain, got so far on his journey. That so it was, having heard of his father's death and circumstances, he had now the world to begin again on a new account, a situation which he assured me in a vein of sincerity that, flowing from his heart, penetrated mine, gave him to farther pain than that he had not in his power to make me as happy as he could wish. My fortune, you will please to observe, I had not entered upon any overture of, reserving to feast myself with the surprise of it to him in calmer instants. And as to my dress, it could give him no idea of the truth, not only as it was mourning, but likewise in a style of plainness and simplicity that I had ever kept to with studied art. He pressed me indeed tenderly to satisfy his ardent curiosity, both with regard to my past and present state of life since his being torn away from me, but I had the address to elude his questions by answers that, showing his satisfaction at no great distance, won upon him to waive his impatience, in favour of the thorough confidence he had in my not delaying it, but for respects I should in good time acquaint him with. Charles, however, thus returned to my longing arms, tender, faithful, and in health, was already a blessing too mighty for my conception. But Charles in distress, Charles reduced and broken down to his naked personal merit, was such a circumstance in favour of the sentiments I had for him as exceeded my utmost desires, and accordingly I seemed so visibly charmed, so out of time and measure pleased at his mention of his ruined fortune, that he could account for it in no way, but that the joy of seeing him again had swallowed up every other sense or concern. In the meantime, my woman had taken all possible care of Charles's travelling companion, and as supper was coming in, he was introduced to me, when I received him, as became my regard for all of Charles's acquaintances and friends. We four then supped together in the style of joy, congratulation, and pleasing disorder that you may guess. For my part, though all these agitations had left me not the least stomach, but for that uncloying feast, the sight of my adored youth, I endeavoured to force it by way of example for him, who I conjectured must want such a recruit after riding, and indeed he ate like a traveller, but gazed at and addressed me all the time like a lover. After the cloth was taken away and the hour of repose came on, Charles and I were, without further ceremony, in quality of man and wife, shown up together to a very handsome apartment, and all in course the bed, they said, the best in the inn. And here, decency, forgive me, if once more I violate thy laws and keeping the curtains undrawn, sacrifice thee for the last time to that confidence without reserve with which I engaged to recount to you the most striking circumstances of my youthful disorders. As soon then as we were in the room together, left to ourselves, the sight of the bed, starting the remembrance of our first joys, and the thought of my being instantly to share it with the dear possessor of my virgin heart, moved me so strongly that it was well I leaned upon him, or I must have fainted again under the overpowering sweet alarm. Charles saw into my confusion, and forgot his own, that was scarce less, to apply himself to the removal of mine. But now the true refining passion had regained thorough possession of me, with all its train of symptoms, a sweet sensibility, a tender timidity, love-sick yearnings tempered with a diffidence and modesty, all held me in a subjection of soul incomparably dearer to me than the liberty of heart with which I had been long, too long, the mistress of. In the course of those grosser gallantries, the consciousness of which now made me sigh with a virtuous confusion and regret. No real virgin, in view of the nuptial bed, could give more bashful blushes to unblemished innocence than I did to a sense of guilt, and indeed I loved Charles too truly not to feel severely that I did not deserve him. As I kept hesitating and disconcerted under this soft distraction, Charles, with fond impatience, took the pains to undress me, and all I can remember amidst the flutter and discomposure of my senses was some flattering exclamations of joy and admiration, more especially at the feel of my breasts, now set at liberty from my stays, and which, panting and rising in tumultuous throbs, swelled upon his dear touch and gave it the welcome pleasure of finding them well formed and unfailed in firmness. I was soon laid in bed, and scarce languished an instant for the darling partner of it, before he was undressed and got between the sheets, with his arms clasped round me, giving and taking, with gust inexpressible, a kiss of welcome, that my heart, rising to my lips, stamped with its warmest impression, concurring too by bliss with that delicate and voluptuous emotion which Charles alone had the secret to excite, and which constitutes the very life, the essence of pleasure. Meanwhile 2 candles lighted on a side table near us, and a joyous wood fire, threw a light into the bed that took from one sense of great importance to our joys, all pretext for complaining of being shut out of its share of them, and indeed the sight of my idolized youth was alone, from the ardour with which I had wished for it, without other circumstance, a pleasure to die of. But as action was now a necessity to desires so much on edge as ours, Charles, after a very short prelusive dalliance, lifting up my linen and his own, laid the broad treasures of his manly chest close to my bosom, both beating with the tenderest alarms. When now the sense of his glowing body, in naked touch with mine, took all power over my thoughts out of my own disposal, and delivered up every faculty of the soul to the sensiblest of joys, that affecting me infinitely more with my distinction of the person than of the sex, now brought my conscious heart deliciously into play. My heart, which eternally constant to Charles, had never taken any part in my occasional sacrifices to the calls of constitution, complaisance, or interest. But what became of me, when as the powers of solid pleasure thickened upon me, I could not help feeling the stiff stake that had been adored with the trophies of my despoiled virginity, bearing hard and inflexible against one of my thighs, which I had not yet opened, from a true principle of modesty, revived by a passion too sincere to suffer any aiming at the false merit of difficulty, or my putting on an impertinent mock coyness. I have, I believe, somewhere before remarked, that the feel of that favourite piece of manhood has, in the very nature of it, something inimitably pathetic. Nothing can be dearer to the touch, nor can affect it with a more delicious sensation. Think then, as a love thinks, what must be the consummate transport of that quickest of our senses, in their central seat too, when after so long a deprival, it felt itself re-inflamed under the pressure of that peculiar sceptre member which commands us all, but especially my darling, elect from the face of the whole earth, and now, at its mightiest point of stiffness, it felt to me something so subduing, so active, so solid and agreeable, that I know not what name to give its singular impression, but the sentiment of consciousness of its belonging to my supremely beloved youth gave me so pleasing an agitation, and worked so strongly on my soul, that it sent all its sensitive spirits to that organ of bliss in me, dedicated to its reception. There, concentring to a point, like rays in a burning glass, they glowed, they burnt with the intensest heat. The springs of pleasure were, in short, wound up to such a pitch, I panted now with so exquisitely keen an appetite for the eminent enjoyment that I was even sick with desire, and unequal to support the combination of two distinct ideas that delightfully distracted me, for all the thought I was capable of was that I was now in touch, at once, with the instrument of pleasure and the great seal of love, ideas that, mingling streams, poured such an ocean of intoxicating bliss on a weak vessel, all too narrow to contain it, that I lay overwhelmed, absorbed, lost in an abyss of joy, and dying of nothing but immoderate delight. Charles then roused me somewhat out of this ecstatic distraction with a complaint softly murmured amidst a crowd of kisses at the position not so favourable to his desires in which I received his urgent insistence for admission, where that insistence was alone so engrossing a pleasure that it made me inconsistently suffer a much dearer one to be kept out. But how sweet to correct such a mistake! My thighs, now obedient to the intimations of love and nature, gladly disclose and with a ready submission resign up the soft gateway to the entrance of pleasure. I see, I feel the delicious velvet tip. He enters me might and main with, oh, my pen drops from me here in the ecstasy now present to my faithful memory. Description too deserts me, and delivers over a task above its strength of wing to the imagination. But it must be an imagination exalted by such a flame as mine that can do justice to that sweetest, noblest of all sensations that hailed and accompanied the stiff insinuation all the way up, till it was at the end of its penetration, sending up through my eyes the sparks of the love fire that ran all over me and blazed in every vein and every pore of me, a system incarnate of joy all over. I had now totally taken in love's true arrow from the point up to the feather, in that part where making now new wound, the lips of the original one of nature which had owed its first breathing to this dear instrument, clung as if sensible of gratitude in eager suction round it, whilst all its inwards embraced it tenderly with a warmth of gust, a compressive energy that gave it, in its way, the heartiest welcome in nature, every fibre there gathering tight round it, and straining ambitiously to come in for its share of the blissful touch. As we were giving them a few moments of pause to the delectation of the senses, in dwelling with the highest relish on this intimatest point of reunion, and chewing the cud of enjoyment, the impatience natural to the pleasure soon drove us into action. Then began the driving tumult on his side, and the responsive heaves on mine, which kept me up to him, whilst, as our joys grew too great for utterance, the organs of our voices, voluptuously intermixing, became organs of the touch, and oh, that touch, how delicious, how poignantly luscious! And now I felt to the heart of me, I felt the prodigious keen edge with which love, presiding over this act, points the pleasure, love, that may be styled the Attic salt of enjoyment, and indeed without it, the joy, great as it is still a vulgar one, whether in a king or beggar, for it is, undoubtedly, love alone that refines, enables and exalts it. Thus happy, then, by the heart, happy by the senses, it was beyond all power even of thought to form the conception of a greater delight than what I was now consummating the fruition of. Charles, whose whole frame was convulsed with the agitation of his rapture, whilst the tenderest fires trembled in his eyes, all assured me of a perfect concord of joy, penetrated me so profoundly, touched me so vitally, took me so much out of my own possession, whilst he seemed himself so much in mine, that in a delicious enthusiasm I imagined such a transfusion of heart and spirit, as that coalescing and making one body and soul with him, I was he, and he me. But all this pleasure tending, like life from its first instants, towards its own dissolution, lived too fast not to bring on upon the spur its delicious moment of mortality, for presently the approach of the tender agony discovered itself by its usual signals, that were quickly followed by my dear love's emanation of himself that spun out and shot feelingly indeed up the ravished-in draught, where the sweetly soothing balmy titillation opened all the juices of joy on my side, which ecstatically in flow helped to allay the prurient glow and drown our pleasure for a while, soon, however, to be on float again. For Charles, true to nature's laws, in one breath expiring and ejaculating, languished not long in the dissolving trance, but recovering spirit again, soon gave me to feel that the true metal springs of his instrument of pleasure were, by love, and perhaps by a long vacation, wound up too high to be let down by a single explosion. His stiffness still stood my friend. Resuming then the action afresh, without dislodging or giving me the trouble of parting from my sweet tenant, we played over again the same opera, with the same delightful harmony and concert. Our ardours, like our love, knew no remission, and all as the tide served my lover, lavish of his stores, and pleasure milked, overflowed me once more from the fullness of his oval reservoirs of the genial emulsion, whilst on my side a convulsive grasp, in the instant of my giving down the liquid contribution, rendered me sweetly subservient at once to the increase of his joy and of its effusions, moving me so as to make me exert all those springs of the compressive exsuction with which the sensitive mechanism of that part thirstily draws and drains the nipple of love, with much such an instinctive eagerness and attachment as, to compare great with less, kind nature engages infants at the breast by the pleasure they find in the motion of their little mouths and cheeks to extract the milky stream prepared for their nourishment. But still there was no end of his vigour. This double discharge had so far from extinguished his desires for that time that it had not even calmed them, and at his age desires are power. He was proceeding then amazingly to push it to a third triumph, still without uncasing, if a tenderness natural to true love had not inspired me with self-denial enough to spare and not overstrain him, and accordingly, entreating him to give himself and me quarter, I obtained at length a short suspension of arms, but not before he had exultingly satisfied me that he gave out standing. The remainder of the night, with what we borrowed upon the day, we employed with unwearied fervour in celebrating thus the festival of our re-meeting, and got up pretty late in the morning, gay, brisk, and alert, though rest had been a stranger to us. But the pleasures of love had been to us what the joy of victory is to an army, repose, refreshment, everything. The journey into the country being now entirely out of the question, and orders having been given overnight for turning the horses' heads towards London, we left the inn as soon as we had breakfasted, not without a liberal distribution of the tokens of my grateful sense of the happiness I had met with in it. Charles and I were in my coach, the captain and my companion in a chaise hired purposely for them, to leave us the conveniency of a tete-a-tete. Here on the road, as the tumult of my senses was tolerably composed, I had command enough to head to break properly to him the course of life that the consequence of my separation from him had driven me into, which, at the same time that he tenderly deplored with me, he was the less shocked at, as on reflecting how he had left me circumstanced, he could not be entirely unprepared for it. But when I opened the state of my fortune to him, and with that sincerity which, from me to him, was so much a nature in me, I begged of him his acceptance of it, on his own terms. I should appear to you perhaps too partial to my passion, were I to attempt the doing his delicacy justice. I shall content myself then with assuring you that after his flatly refusing the unreserved, unconditional donation that I long persecuted him in vain to accept, it was at length, in obedience to his serious commands, For I stood out unaffectedly till he exerted the sovereign authority which love had given him over me, that I yielded my consent to waive the remonstrance I did not fail of making strongly to him against his degrading himself and incurring the reflection, however unjust, of having, for respects of fortune, bartered his honour for infamy and prostitution in making one his wife, who thought herself too much honoured in being but his mistress. The plea of love then overruling all objections, Charles entirely won with the merit of my sentiments for him, which he could not but read the sincerity of in a heart ever open to him, obliged me to receive his hand, by which means I was in pass, among other innumerable blessings, to bestow a legal parentage on those fine children you have seen by this happiest of matches. Thus at length I got snug into port, where in the bosom of virtue I gathered the only uncorrupt sweets, where, looking back on the course of vice I had run, and comparing its infamous blandishments with the infinitely superior joys of innocence, I could not help pitying, even in point of taste, those who, immersed in gross sensuality, are insensible to the delicate charms of virtue, than which even pleasure has not a greater friend, nor than vice a greater enemy. Thus temperance makes men lords over those pleasures that intemperance enslaves them to, the one parent of health, vigour, fertility, cheerfulness, and every other desirable good of life, the other of diseases, debility, barrenness, self-loathing, with only every evil incident to human nature. You laugh, perhaps, at this tale-piece of morality, extracted from me by the force of truth, resulting from compared experiences. You think it, no doubt, out of place, out of character. Possibly, too, you may look on it as the paltry finesse of one who seeks to mask a devotee to vice under a rag of a veil, impudently smuggled from the shrine of virtue, just as if one was to fancy one's self completely disguised at a masquerade, with no other change of dress than turning one's shoes into slippers, or as if a writer should think to shield a treasonable libel by concluding it with a formal prayer for the king. But, independent of my flattering myself that you have a juster opinion of my sense and sincerity, give me leave to represent to you that such a supposition is even more injurious to virtue than to me, since, consistently with candour and good nature, it can have no foundation but in the falsest of fears, that its pleasures cannot stand in comparison with those of vice. But let truth dare to hold it up in its most alluring light, then mark how spurious, how low of taste, how comparatively inferior its joys are to those which virtue gives sanction to, and whose sentiments are not above making even a sauce for the senses, but a sauce for the highest relish, whilst vices are the harpies that infect and foul the feast. The paths of vice are sometimes strewed with roses, but then they are forever infamous for many a thorn, for many a canker worm. Those of virtue are strewed with roses purely, and those eternally unfading ones. If you do me then justice, you will esteem me perfectly consistent in the incense I burn to virtue. If I have painted vice in all its gayest colours, if I have decked it with flowers, it has been solely in order to make the worthier, the solemner sacrifice of it to virtue. You know Mr. C.O., you know his estate, his worth, and good sense. Can you, will you pronounce it ill meant, at least of him, when anxious for his son's morals, with a view to form him to virtue, and inspire him with a fixed, a rational contempt for vice, he condescended to be his master of the ceremonies, and led him by the hand through the most noted bawdy houses in town, where he took care he should be familiarized with all those scenes of debauchery so fit to nauseate a good taste? The experiment, you will cry, is dangerous. True, on a fool, but are fools worth so much attention? I shall see you soon, and in the meantime think candidly of me, and believe me ever, madam, yours, etc., etc., etc. The End. End of section 10. End of Fanny Hill Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure. Thank you for listening.